Okay. Welcome back to this session. And it is my pleasure to introduce you to our third keynote speaker. So from psychology back to computing, but a different field of computing, Dr. Thomas Ploetz from the Georgia Institute of Technology. I'm really happy that he accepted our invitation. And again, it's the idea of taking inspiration from other areas that are related to us, but not exactly what we're doing. And so the expertise, and say Thomas Ploetz is well known in the area of affective computing, and his expertise is in the modeling of computational modeling of human behavior in real life context. And we learned in the previous keynote talk how context is critical, and we really have to move and bring that variable into our modeling. So I hope this talk will be very inspiring. And I think it's also very interesting for us because what Thomas does is developing new machine learning method to analyze data from various types of sensors, also wearable sensors. So we saw yesterday from Elizabeth, who was at for people who were at the town hall meeting, on how we are still very narrow in the way we sense our people. So it would be interesting to see what people are doing in other areas and how much we can learn from them, and maybe also share our our approaches. So I hope you will enjoy Thomas' talk, and I leave you the podium.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Nadia, for the nice introduction. Thanks for having me. When Nadia and I were in touch in a different matter last year, end of last year, early this year, and she brought up the idea of having me here give a keynote, I must admit I wasn't entirely aware of this community over here. So this is not my home community. My home community is typically the UbiCom community, wearables, machine learning kind of conferences. I was a little concerned. Is there enough I can actually give you that you can actually benefit from sitting here through an hour of my presentation? She very quickly talked me out of that, so appreciate that. Out of that concern. So it gave me the opportunity to reflect a little bit upon the past 10 years or something that I've been working in the field of behavior analysis. And you might have noticed that I snuck in quite sneakishly a little word in there, computational behavior analysis. So my background, as Nadia said, is computer science. So I got my degree in a pattern recognition. That was the word for machine learning back in the days, kind of topic. The sound didn't improve, by the way. So I try not to yell. Oh, that's probably it. Okay, so I got my degree in pattern recognition back in Germany, and then I moved into the health area with the objective of becoming a more applied person. So I'm a quite proud applied computer scientist. I want to build systems that can actually be deployed, that can make a difference in real-world applications to people in their everyday life, and that's where health comes in. So I used the time to reflect a little bit upon, so where is the community going? So the community of computational behavior analysis, where is it coming from? Where are we today? What are the next frontiers? And that hopefully connects a little bit to the affective computing community, and that's kind of like the journey we want to go on here. I want to start with 3 examples of what I mean by computation behavior analysis. I noticed a few familiar faces over here, and you might probably know this setting over here. What you're going to see is first is a video of a little boy. You might see the striking resemblance of me. That's my son, who was volunteered in the age of 15 months or something to be in the lab and to try out the stuff that was built in the lab. So that's an example from an endeavor that was led by Georgia Tech. Not by me, by fellow colleagues over there, and it was a relatively large NSF expedition in computational behavior science. What you're going to see is here an interaction, how it is envisioned for screening of for autism. On the right, not in the picture right now, is the psychologist, the therapist who works with the child, engages the child into a structured interaction. The child obviously doesn't know it's structured. For the child, it's a playful interaction. And what she does, and what the psychologists here, the human observers, are looking for are certain behavioral signals. Behavioral signals that might be indicative for autism in this case. She's going to call his name. He's called Aaron. And then she's looking for him responding to the name, making eye contact. And then he engages him into a playful interaction. And that is the kind of scenarios we're looking at, these kind of scenarios where we're looking at building systems, developing systems that can automate and can support these kind of observations.
Aaron.
There's the eye contact. It was a little shy back then.
Go. Ready? 1, 2, 3, go!
So she's engaging him into a dyadic interaction.
1, 2, 3, go!
And it's a little sneaky as well.
Go. Okay, let me put the box.
That's the kind of scenarios where psychologists are in the room, are observing certain behavioral factors, certain behavioral signals in there, and trying to come up with a conclusion. Is there risk for autism? Are there certain indicators for autism? Yes or no? Here's a second example. The elder gentleman here is a Parkinson's patient. What you see on the left is him being off his medication. And you can see typical symptoms of Parkinson's. So you see, if you look carefully in his arm, you see the typical tremor in Parkinson's, you see the shuffling of his feet. He's struggling to keep up with his walking, so that's called freeze of gait. There are certain behavioral aspects, there are certain aspects you can observe without sticking a needle into the patient. You can observe what is happening in this patient's life. What is the stage of his Parkinson's in this case? On the right, the same gentleman with medication. Well, he still has this kind of awkward gait, but is much more fluent. So he can cope on his own. He can walk down the aisle. He doesn't need the constant encouragement of the caregiver here. So these are two aspects in there. In Parkinson's, it's important to track the symptoms, the behavioral symptoms, in order to administer the medication at the right time and at the right doses. That's an observational aspect. And the third example is from an ongoing project, what we've been doing back in my time at Newcastle, still ongoing, where we look into movement and behavior patterns in newborns. So what you see here are two infants. They're both preterm. The left infant is a typical developing, and you can see the usual curiosity, the independent movement of the limbs. And on the right is an infant who had a perinatal stroke. He had a stroke while being in the womb of the mother. And it's a substantial event, and you can see the difference in the movements of the limbs. So there's synchronized cramps. Every now and then he doesn't move one limb at all. The crying doesn't matter too much. The infants do cry. That's what they do. But there's a striking difference between the two behaviors of these individuals here. And the problem is, if you can't recognize early enough or soon enough that the child had a perinatal stroke, then the chances to develop cerebral palsy are really high in general, and then you need to do something about it. You need, at the very least, provide the care for this. So these are three examples from the clinical practice, how clinicians, how occupational therapists, psychologists look at behavior. And they use behavior as an indicator of what is going on in a certain condition. What is the stage of a patient in their condition? What it basically boils down is that clinicians are interested in characterizing the behavioral phenotype of a condition. And there are many different definitions of behavioral phenotypes. So I'm basically going with the one from Cassidy and Morris, and I'm adopting and adapting it a little bit towards that the behavioral phenotype is the characteristic, cognitive, personality, and especially behavioral and psychiatric pattern that typifies a specific condition. So from a computational perspective, what we are looking at is observational. So we're primarily looking at the behavioral parts. And behavioral parts basically boils down to whatever you can actually observe. And I think that's where we can match the community of affective computing and this computational behavior analysis here. What you can observe primarily manifests in this case in movements and in changes of movements. This behavioral phenotype is characterized by specific signals. And those signals, those indicators for this behavioral phenotype, they're dependent on the condition. Right? In the autism case, you had this dyadic interactions, these going back and forth into a certain interaction. The psychologists try to establish a joint attention. You have this response to name calling. In Parkinson's, you have the motor symptoms. The motor symptoms, the tremor, the shuffling, etc. These are behavioral indicators, they're behavioral signals that people or the observers look for. So the challenge is to observe these behavioral signals, to recognize these behavioral signals, and ideally not only to do this in the clinic. Right? In the clinic, typically you see your occupational therapist if you're a patient in Parkinson's. In the UK, that's the data I know. If you're lucky, it's every fortnight. So if you're not lucky, it's once a month. So you have access to a clinical specialist once a month, maybe every 2 weeks, who can observe your symptoms, and based on these observations, these really small snapshot observations, makes a recommendation, makes a decision on how you put you on the medication. Right? That's not ideal. What would be ideal, and that's where the computational aspect kicks in, is if you had a system, and that's what this whole community of computational behavior analysis is aiming for, if you had a system that could monitor these behavioral aspects continuously and outside of the clinic. Right? And that's where we're basically kicking in. That's our umbrella term, it's our starting point. We're not talking about behavior monitoring, behavior manipulation on Facebook, on any kind of other social media, as we've seen this in the media in the past. This is purely about health-related behavior observations and ideally automated tracking in there. So when we look at that, then we have basically we have a spectrum here where we would observe behavior. So there is the state of the art, the status quo in the clinical research, which is in the clinic. Right? Behavior observation in the clinic is reliable, is accurate, because you have trained personnel, you have all the knowledge, the expert knowledge on the condition. That's where it's happening. It's objective in the sense that as much as the clinical personnel agrees, in Germany we have a saying, you have 3 doctors and 4 opinions. So that's the objectivity you have in there, and it's interpretability. But it's in the clinic, right? It's this snapshot interpretation. On the other hand, there's real life. Real life situations where you were outside of the clinic would be accessible, hopefully continuous, and hopefully affordable. As usual in life, we can't have everything for free. And what we basically have is a dilemma that we are either on the one side or on the other one. We can push it a little bit in the middle, and what we're trying to do in this field of computational behavior analysis is to find the sweet spot, which is in the first instance somewhere in the middle, where those 2 lines actually cross. Now that's not ideal, because ideally we would like to be on the upper right. Right? We want to be outside of the clinic. We want to be accessible, as in it should be mobile, whatever our setting is. It should be affordable, while at the same time being reliable and accurate. Right? That's the ultimate vision, the ultimate direction where people want to go. So that sets basically the scene. And now we're looking a little bit with this umbrella term. Where are we coming from? Where are we at right now? And what are the next frontiers in this field? And by looking through those and going in this journey, we're trying to make a connection to your community here and see how both sides can basically benefit from here. So there are 3 aspects we're basically talking about. If you're interested in behavior, then first of all you need to capture the behavior. That's where the technical side comes in there. So what kind of sensing modalities make sense to capture this behavior that is relevant for certain clinical or health condition. Then you need to analyze the data. That's the second part. And the analysis typically corresponds to or is represented by signal processing and machine learning techniques. All right? And then the big push and the big promise of going outside of the clinic is that you actually deploy that. And that's the third part in there. I want to look a little bit into so what are people doing these days? How do we use these techniques in the real life? All right. And let's get started with the first aspect. How do we capture behavior? For that, let's go back to this happy little fellow over here. This is a lab scenario. This is not a clinical scenario. That's a lab that's set up at the Georgia Tech Child Study Lab, where there was, as part of this NSF expedition, this bigger project, there was a setup where families with the children came in. We have trained personnel, the woman on the right, who engage with the children into the interaction and record this kind of data. They record the behavioral data. And for that, they use sensors. Right? And there's a lot of sensors you see here. The starting point is the therapist called his name. And then basically the idea was to look for the behavioral signal. Is he responding to this name, yes or no? Right? And then you need the microphone is on her end, so she's wearing a microphone as well. There are cameras on the table that basically observe him and the therapist. And quite honestly, there's many, many more cameras in the room. And there's many, many more microphones in the room. And what we also have is wearable sensors over here. These sensors are probably very familiar to many of you. These are the predecessors of the empathicas, the Q sensors. These are basically galvanic skin response sensors to try to capture the affective state. For me, more interesting, these are movement sensors. So there are accelerometers in there, there's inertial measurement units in there that measure these movements of the child. There's also sensors in the toys. There are more cameras, more microphones around it. So my point is there's a whole zoo of sensors in here just for the one example, for the one application case of measuring these kind of interactions. Going back to our real world versus clinic dilemma. What kind of sensors are out there? What sensors do people use? The first thing is people who work in the computation behavior analysis community are typically not sensor producers. Like me, they're opportunistic. They use the sensors that give them the signal. They use the sensors that can actually capture the behavior, capture the activities that are of relevance for a certain assessment. And there are many. And arguably, and I think if I understand this community correct enough or well enough, at least 50% of you are probably following this. Arguably, there's a universal sensor that's called a camera. Right? This is an RGB camera. If you are interested in more detail, you can have a more fancy camera. You can have a 3D camera. And then you basically capture everything you need, you would think. The answer is yes and no. You would be able to do that, but in a way, you are constrained to where you can actually put the camera. Yes, I can hear you. There are mobile cameras out there as well, and people use a lot of mobile cameras. I'm a very active cyclist, and in the cycling community, a lot of people put the camera on their helmet. It's just to record their moment of death when they got run over by a car. At least they have evidence afterwards. So there are mobile cameras out there. But if you're doing computer vision, then you know that the moment you leave your nice little comfort zone of doing assessments in a certain scenario, in a certain room, and you go outside, then things get messy. Then computer vision gets really complicated. Right? So I argue cameras are basically for static scenarios for being in the clinic. That's where they're being used right now, heavily. There's an alternative to that. That's a picture I've borrowed from Shredak Patel, who's in this whole Ubicom and sensing community. One of the reasons I moved into this field of computation behavior analysis is that at some point, some 10, 12 years ago, wearable sensors became a thing. Right? I'm wearing a Fitbit right now. Many of you probably wear something similar as well. Wearable sensors are a thing. With wearable sensors, you can put the sensors on the patients, on your clients, into their everyday life. You can record behavior where it actually happens. That is super attractive. It's attractive because they're accessible, they're cheap, they are somewhat reliable, and they are not intrusive. So that brings us very close to the right-hand side of our diagram. Another thing is we all have the universal wearable sensor, the mobile phone. A lot of people use mobile phones for behavior capturing, for behavior assessments. mobile phones not only have the movement sensors, the typical inertial measurement units, you can measure an awful lot of more sensors in there. Right? There's some people here in the room who look into social interactions through the mobile phone. You can look into behavior patterns that are related to the way you interact with your phone that can be indicative for certain parameters. There's wonderful work pioneered at Dartmouth College called Student Life, where folks look into changes in interaction patterns with the phone as one channel of behavior, and correlate this to something like academic progress of students in college. There's extensions of that work where people look into behavior patterns through the phone and trying to link this to mental health and well-being. So we have a ton of sensors, and they're readily accessible. I'm pretty sure each and every one of us has a phone here right now. Right, so that puts us on the upper right, and that's where we want to be. It's accessible, it's continuous in terms of recording. Is it reliable, is it accurate? That's a different matter. Right? That depends a little bit on what you actually do with the data. Here's, for wearable sensors, I put two more sensors in there. They are basically like the opposite of the spectrum. So you have a wearable sensor here, it's a relatively cheap one, which is just a bare bone accelerometer, wrist one accelerometer. And then this one is probably very known in this community over here. That's the upper end on wrist one devices, an Empatica E4, $1,600, and gives you all the sensor information you might want. In terms of sensing, we're still at the edge of capturing behavior. There was a big trend in the late 90s, early 2000s, where sensing became affordable, became accessible. Computing made a big jump, and people started to realize, oh, we can actually move away from laptops, we can move away from desktop computers. And they started putting sensors into homes. This is the Aware Home in Atlanta. It was built in 1999, like way before my time, before I joined Georgia Tech. And that's a smart house. A smart house from the late 90s. We built one in Germany as well, where I did my postdoc, and it was an engineer's dream until we finished it. And then it was just sitting there. And we didn't really know what to do with that. And I think that was the fate of many of these smart houses. Same here. And it wasn't abandoned, but it was respected that it's there for many years. But it's coming back now. It's coming back now because the change is the stuff you can actually buy these days. So nowadays, people can actually have their smart homes. They can have their smart homes, and they have kind of an idea what they do with that. Right, so I had a conversation with my wife yesterday because we have new windows in our house. We need a new alarm system. And the alarm system, of course, the folks from the alarm system, they try to sell us a smart house. So I can have alarms on my phone right now that someone breaks into our house in Atlanta. It doesn't help me much because I'm 4,000 miles away, but at the very least I would know. But what has changed is that those things are there now. So you can assume that in a relatively modern house, in a relatively modern flat, you have some sort of sensing, which is fantastic from a behavior assessment point of view. We built a system in Newcastle where we instrumented a kitchen with sensors, and the idea there was, it was a dementia setting to assess how well people cope, how well dementia patients cope with their kitchen activities, which is a wonderful proxy to assess how much the cognitive decline in dementia is progressing. So they are a thing. They're certainly not mobile. So they are more on the clinical end over here because you're basically turning your house, your kitchen into a clinic. But they are there. Here's an interesting compromise. We all know these guys, right? These are these voice-based assistants, Alexa and Google Home and all those. And for a while, we believed that nobody is listening to us when talking to them. It's not entirely true, as we now know. But an interesting thing is these are basically an embodiment of an agent for people to interact with intelligent services in there. And a colleague of mine, Edison Thomas, is currently working on a very interesting project. So he's looking into behavior patterns, into interaction patterns, where he's basically trying to identify acoustic biomarkers for mental health and well-being by looking at how people interact with their Alexa. He tells us it doesn't have access what they're actually saying. That's only what Amazon has. Amazon knows what you're talking to, what you're talking about to Alexa, but he knows when people talk to Alexa. He knows who is talking to Alexa. Is it the same person? Are there multiple people in the room? He knows what kind of subjects are people talking about. Is it just the weather? Is it the music, etc., etc.? So it's a very weak signal, but it's a universal or ubiquitously accessible signal. That's what he's trying to extract over here, to use it as a capture, as a proxy for behavior that might be of relevance for mental health and well-being. So that's a very interesting development. So I put this somewhere in the middle. And then there's the final bit here. That's where the whole field of activity recognition basically started. Before wearables were an actual thing, you put sensors into the objects that people are actually using to perform certain activities. That's work from Newcastle, where small movement sensors, inertial measurement units, were basically integrated into the utensils that are used for certain kitchen tasks, and then based on that, you could infer about what activity is going on, and to some extent, how well do people perform certain activities. So that is kind of like the overview of what kind of sensing modalities are out there. The essence or the bottom line here is there's a whole zoo of sensors there. People can be opportunistic, people are opportunistic, and they use them depending on the scenarios they're actually interested in. Right? The biggest push probably is coming from the availability of commodity devices. We can call them commodity devices, wearables, mobile phones, everything you use every day, and people use this in an opportunistic way. So with that, we can go back to our assessment scenarios. We had autism, Parkinson's, and perinatal stroke. This is a different use case in autism. I'll come to in a second. For autism assessments, what is the reality, the clinical reality of these kind of behavior assessments that do not necessarily require a clinician here? So we had the lab screener with the little fellow over here, this structured interaction. So the recording of the behaviors, the capturing of the behavior is passive, while the generation of the behavior, if you like, so how you generate this behavior, how to stimulate this behavior is active. Because the clinician over here is following a certain protocol. That basically stimulates, it provokes certain behavioral signals to be measured, to be able to measure those using the setting there. Here's another one. That is pioneered by Matthew Goodwin at Northeastern University in Boston, that basically looks at that one specific behavioral signal, a specific indicator of autism, and it's stereotypical behavior, this repetitive behaviors. So this little boy engaged into this hand flapping that's relatively characteristic for autism. Repetitive behavior, stimming, body rocking, that's something that people are very interested in analyzing because it's indicative for autism and also for the severity in there. So problem here is it's not quite clear what kind of specific behavior these are. The only thing that is clear, it's repetitive. Right? And what he does is he uses body-worn IMUs, also uses some cameras, and actually builds systems that can detect and recognize these repetitive behaviors both in the lab and in the school setting. Right? So leaving the clinic towards a less constrained, less confined space. Here's some work we've been doing for the last N years, and N is getting bigger and bigger. We look into a specific aspect over here of aggressive behaviors, of problem behaviors in autism. So some individuals on the autism spectrum engage into relatively aggressive behavior, into problematic behavior such as self-injury or disruptive behavior. And we're building a system there based on body-worn IMUs that recognizes certain problem behaviors such as aggressive hits, aggressive pushes, hair pulling, throwing objects, etc., and ideally in a non-lab setting. So ideally we want to give these behavior monitors to the families, to the individuals, to wear it in their everyday life. Ideally, because we're still in the clinic. We're still not there yet. Those are volunteers, by the way. They are recording data for us. All right, that's the autism case. Parkinson's. The general characteristic, general phenotype I've explained already briefly. So this is a very famous illustration from, I think, 100 years ago or something of what is the phenotype of Parkinson's. And what you see is very characteristic motor symptoms motor symptoms as in the sense it's the slouching, it's the shuffling of the feet, it's the tremor, the general slowness of movements, bradykinesia, all symptoms you can observe and you can measure using sensors. I showed you this example before. The gold standard in clinical Parkinson's assessment right now is patient diaries. So we've seen this in our work that patients come into the clinic, let's say every fortnight to be optimistic, and then basically fill in or hand in a patient diary on an hourly basis to describe how were their symptoms, how well did they cope with the symptoms, their motor symptoms during the past 2 weeks. That is the gold standard. It's ridiculous. You can't have an hourly patient diary for your everyday life. But based on that, based on these data, the medication regimens are optimized. Right? So they change the medication, how much medication, and when is medication administered. And the idea is, or the goal is to optimize the on-state, the amount of time the patient spends with the symptoms well under control, and minimize when they're out of control, and ideally eliminate the side effects of dyskinesia. So, patient diary, that is the gold standard. We started out and said like, well, if it's motor symptoms, then we can do something about it. So there's a project that was ongoing with a relatively large patient group where we used relatively simple body-worn sensors, again, wrist-worn accelerometers. They have a battery runtime or a runtime of 2 weeks, because that was kind of like the interval we had. So every 2 weeks, the patients come into the clinic and can then basically swap the sensors there. And there's a relatively complicated machine learning framework that basically figures out, based on the sensor data, in what stage is the patient. So it provides objective data. So in our diagram, we're getting up on the objectivity level, but it does it so in a reliable and accessible way. We have a correlation of something like 0.8 to gold standard diaries where patients were really paying careful attention on their motor symptoms. Right? Perinatal stroke, you see this example over here. So these funnily colored wristbands, they're basically there to make our life in computer vision a bit easier. So you notice the white background and the colored wristbands. That makes computer vision trivial. The idea here is, and that's what we did, is we built a system that you can easily integrate into something like a baby monitor, such that the infants can be monitored at home, and you can look at the movements of the limbs. We also use it with accelerometer data, because in these pouches there are accelerometers in there. And the system, again, a relatively complex machine learning system, achieves the accuracy or the skills of a trained human observer. So that is great. It doesn't outperform the human observer. We will not make the human observer obsolete, but it helps to provide data points in real life scenarios, not just in clinic. That's the general gist of it. So where do we want to capture, how do we want to capture behavior? We want to do it in a continuous way. That's where the field is heading to. It's opportunistic in the sense that we're not dogmatic about what kind of sensors do we use. If it's a camera, we can make use of the camera. Let's go for it. Typically, we focus on these wearables because they are providing the best opportunity of capturing behavior that actually happens outside of the clinic. So now we have basically all the data in the world, and the community can basically capture this data, and there's many, many projects. I showed you a few of those, where you can actually capture this behavior that is of clinical relevance. Now what to do with that? So you could argue the hard job is done, because you got all the sensors in there, now the fun begins. Or you argue the other way around, depending on the perspective. Now you have all this messy data, what to do with this data? This is how the data typically looks like. It probably looks familiar to many of you if you're not working with cameras. If you're working with cameras, your life is a little bit easier because you can actually interpret the data a bit better. So who knows what happened here? So this is running. This is something else. This is an exemplary display of a triaxial accelerometer with a relatively high sampling rate. It's 100 hertz in this case. And that's from one sensor. When we talk about this zoo of sensors, that we had in the first part of the talk here, then you can easily multiply this with a factor of 10. That's the kind of data you get. And then the task from an analysis perspective is to first identify relevant parts in here, and then put a label on them, and on top of that, put a label or a quantification of the quality of that in. That's the assessment of the behavior. It's not only recognizing, it's also assessing how well are these activities performed. Is there anything changing? The conventional approach, and that's where the field is basically coming from, what's still prevalent in the clinical practice and in the field's practice, is to follow some sort of a pipeline approach. So you start with recording the data. So you did your job, identifying, specifying the sensors you want to use for capturing the behavior. Then you have to deal with this data. Then the first thing you do with this raw data, you make it look nicer. You optimize the data. There's an awful lot of filtering in there. There's normalization in there. There's filling the gaps where the sensors failed, because surprise, surprise, these sensors might fail every now and then. So that's basically what you do. That's the whole engineering pipeline. And then the typical approach is to come up with a segmentation approach where you look at small portions of the data, small portions of consecutive samples of your sensor readings, and you treat them as individual units, and then you put a label and then you classify them. First challenge here is how much context is enough. Right? One sample from a sensor that fires with 100 hertz gives you 100 readings per second. One sample doesn't tell you anything. How many would it be? 50? 100? 1,000? It depends on the context. Right? In this case, in this conventional pipeline, people try to shy away from this decision to make a decision how much context is enough, basically for the benefit of having the comfort in the end to basically go to their favorite machine learning toolkit and pick the one they like the best. And that's a bit of the zeitgeist. So it used to be support vector machines. These days we're back to neural networks. We call it a different term, deep learning, but that's basically what it is. Right? So that's a pipeline that is easily to implement, but has a lot of issues in there. And the issues lie in the nature of the phenomenon we are studying here. So we're studying behavior, studying human behavior. These are not images. These are typical sequences of sensor readings. And they come at the first and foremost with a ton of noise. Noise from body-worn sensors wobbling around. Noise from generic ambiguity of what people actually do and how people actually perform their activities. There's a ton of stuff to be done about. And the second bigger complex is these data sets, they are not very benign. They're real-world data sets. And what you see on the upper right over here, that's the actual class distribution of one of our benchmark data sets in the field. And the green class is the null class. So 3/4 of the data is actually not all that interesting. Right? The other small slices in here, that's the activities, that's the portion of the data people are interested in. Right? So in order to work with this, in order to train the system for that and to evaluate the system for that, you need different approaches. You can't just use the box standard classification pipeline. That's where the field is heading to. So first, what do we do about the noise? Bill Clinton once said, it's the economy, and then he used the word. I'm adopting that, and that's what happens a lot in the community. The main focus on the analysis techniques is developing a reasonable representation of our data. A reasonable representation of the accelerometer data, of the data you caught from your phone, potentially from the cameras as well, and that's called features. In computer vision, in speech, we have a very nice understanding of what is a good representation of our data. In speech, there's decades of psychoacoustic research. We know exactly how speech is produced. That's encoded in a thing called MFCC, mel frequency substrate coefficients. In those sensor data we don't have the equivalent of that. And what people typically do is they come up with ideas and representing our data using statistical measures. Something like the mean, standard deviation, kurtosis, or whatever. So certain statistical measures that represent the data. That doesn't generalize very well. It typically means whenever you start going to a new approach into a new domain, you observe a different behavior, you're interested in measuring different behaviors, you need a different set of features. That's not great. What's happening is there are basically two approaches. First one is to focus on distribution-based features and to actually learn the underlying distributions of the sensor data, and then basically take a sparse representation of these actual distributions as features. More popular in recent days is, and that's basically reasoned by the fact that while we don't have an awful lot of label data, we have a virtually unlimited amount of unlabeled data. This Fitbit right now is recording data. My phone somewhere is recording data. Your phones, your Fitbits are recording data. We're not providing any labels, we have the data. So what people do is they use this data in an unsupervised learning approach and trying to find some sort of a latent representation by looking at the raw sensor data with an autoencoder-based approach, where you basically say, like, okay, we have an encoder-decoder sequence that tries to find a lower dimensional internal latent representation, and that representation we use as the features. That has picked up enormously in popularity and in speed, because now we have the data, and with the enormous success of deep learning, we have the tools for doing that. That is very, very popular. Here's another aspect. In computer vision, where we have large amounts of labeled data, it's very easy, it's very straightforward these days to build very powerful classification systems. So this is a face recognition. So many of you probably know this. It's a convolutional neural networks. Here we have 3 layers in there. And these are the actual filter responses. This is what the model actually learns. So you see in the first layer something like edges. That's very nice, that's very intuitive, because that's kind of like how our visual cortex works. When we look around in the world, the first thing our brain does comes up with some sort of an edge detection in there. Next one is, that looks like eyes, right? So it's the next level, what these features, what these filters actually learn. And if you squint a little bit, then you see this one here that looks like faces, right? So that's easily interpretable, and that makes a lot of sense. If you're not interested in face recognition, but interested in, let's say, car recognition, you want to recognize cars on the road, you can still use this one, because you still have edges, right? That's transferable. Transferability and transfer learning is a thing in computer vision. It works very well, and there's an awful lot of great research. Here's the bad news. This is how it looks like with sensor data. So that's some work from folks in Sussex, where they looked into these kind of filter responses for a task on activity recognition using body-worn sensors. And what you have now here is the filter responses. So those guys here are now in this direction, and here are different tasks. Typical tasks, how you perform them in the kitchen, like opening a drawer, opening certain doors. And here's from another data set, open and close the hood, from a car manufacturer. So you have different activities in there, and over here we have the activations of these filters. So first of all, this is how these filters look like. These are the filter responses. There's no actually equivalent, like intuitively, to the faces over here. You could say that's fair enough, because we don't have the spatial dimension here. It's only the accelerometer data, so we only have this in time. That's fair enough. But they all look relatively the same. So, and they look the same, that basically means, do we really need all those filters? Probably not. And the biggest indicator for those is the color and the depth or the width of the thickness of the lines in here. Green means this filter is actually activated in order to recognize an activity called write notepad, open hood, close hood, and so on. So if we look at this one, it's all the same. Well, here's a few different ones, but it's primarily this filter over here. This filter kind of catches everything. Can this really be? Or is it just overfitting? Is it just overfitting on some very small parts in there? Same here, the thickness, the general thickness of these lines, that indicates a very strong overfitting. So transfer learning is an issue. Transfer learning doesn't work at the moment. Transfer learning doesn't work at the moment because probably we don't have enough label data. That's an issue in the field. That's where people are pushing for. There's a few interesting papers coming out next week at the Ubiquim and ISWI conference, not from my group, from other folks, but there is work in this field that's actually happening. Right. I mentioned noise. We talked a little bit about noise, and the answer to noise is features. Dealing with nasty data sets with uncertain annotations where we have a skew distribution, all that, that's an issue. It's really hard to deal with that. Here's an interesting aspect. This is an ensemble, right? So this is an orchestra. Late 90s, Leo Breiman, I believe from Berkeley, came up with the idea of looking at data, at the same set of data from different angles. That's the whole idea of ensemble learning. The idea is you take your limited data sets or a data set you have, and then you shuffle it through a little bit, and then you basically build classifiers to look at the data from a different angle. Just like playing music. They're all playing the same piece of music, but from different angles. So the violin has a different aspect to it, plays a different role in there, the cello plays a different role in there, et cetera, et cetera. That was very popular in the 2000s. Face recognition folks remember the Viola Jones, the cascade of very simple classifiers that led to a breakthrough in face recognition. That's coming back. That's coming back because in this field where we're talking about, and here's an approach where we looked at data, at our messy sensor data, and acknowledging the fact, A, that we don't have a ton of label data, B, that we can't trust the data entirely. The idea is basically saying, okay, the data we have, let's say 20% of the data is garbage. It's garbage for various reasons. We don't have the labels, we can't trust the labels, sensor might get stuck somewhere, there's noise, et cetera, et cetera. 20% is debatable, but some percentage of the data is not usable. That's good. Bad is, what are the 20%? You know, which of the samples in your data set is the 20% you can't use? Well, we don't make this decision. We basically just train a ton of classifiers, like in the ensemble approach, and use different aspects, different views on the data to train our individual classifiers. So that's the old ensemble idea. What's new is that we're not using the simple, the stupid classifiers as we had in the cascades from the early 2000s, like in Viola Jones face recognizer, but we're using really strong classifiers now. So this is kind of like the strongest sequential neural network you can find these days, an LSTM model, long short-term memory model, and we're combining those. It takes a while to train them, but there are significant pushes there. And that basically recognizes that there is uncertainty in the data, and you have to acknowledge data. You can't just hope for more data to be collected and annotated, but you can model that, and that's what's happening there. So, to sum up the direction of the analysis. So what's happening here? We're coming from, in the early days, from this exploration where we used this relatively standard pipeline-based approach for analyzing the data. Sliding window, your favorite feature extraction, your favorite classifier. That works well, that's the bread and butter. People moved on primarily in the direction of learning better representation, using the data we have, as messy as it would be, to extract features, to learn powerful features that can generalize. That's where we are right now. And then obviously people are attracted by the tremendous success of end-to-end learning. End-to-end learning, as in deep learning, is a thing. The flavor in the behavior assessment is that we actually look into sequential modeling. So we're moving away from the sliding window-based approach. We're using the model to actually segment the data, and we're using sequential models such as LSTMs and GRUs for that. So that is the big trend in there. Now what do we do with that? Now we have means of capturing behavior. We have a zoo of sensors. We have some sort of assessment what kind of sensors we can use when. We have a rich toolkit, a well-equipped toolkit of analysis methods. Now what do we do with that? Well, we deploy it. My colleague Gregory Abaut said in 2011, that's a striking 8 years ago, in 5 years, so that's 2016, the majority of clinically relevant data will be collected in non-clinical settings. He said this, and he had to say this because he's Mr. Ubicom. And in 2011, there was a time when wearables and mobile phones and everything took off. So the hope was, with the availability of the sensors, we can actually hope for getting all this data from non-clinical settings. My question is, are we there yet? I would argue no. Yes, you may provide your blood pressure measurements to your clinician, to your general practitioner, but do you really provide movement data, behavior data to your general practitioner, such that the GP can actually make a diagnosis and based on the diagnosis provide you care, therapy, medication? I think we are on our way, but we're stopping short of being like really outside of the clinic. Right? Just to wrap up, I want to give 2 examples of where the field is actually happening with the assessments. And the trend we can see here is that, yes, there is individualized assessment. Yes, there are models that are tailored towards your condition, your circumstances, using your sensor, your phone. But the actual trend here is that people realize, well, there's a lot of people who actually own these kind of sensors. Let's make use of that. And that leads to very large-scale deployments. And 2 quick examples of those. This is one I was involved in, where a consortium here in the UK Biobank Consortium, realized at some point that wearables are a thing. Right? The Biobank is a consortium that basically samples at population scale certain parameters, certain variables. They do MRI scans, they do all kind of measurements, and they at some point realized that movement sensors are a thing. So they went ahead and shipped out no less than 100,000 devices. Sorry, it was not 100,000 devices, but they shipped devices to 100,000 participants. And the devices are relatively simple triaxial accelerometers. And they asked their participants, 100,000 participants, to wear this device for a week on their dominant hand. So I'm wearing my Fitbit on my left hand, and I'm a right-handed person, so I'm violating this already. So, okay, questionable. But if you do the maths here, that's 100,000 participants, each wearing a device for 7 days. That's a staggering about 2,000 person-years of data. 2,000 person-years of raw accelerometer data, 100 hertz. Right? It's a pain to download from the servers. It's like 25 terabyte or something, but it's a huge treasure trove of data. So what to do with that? The number of samples, the number of annotations, what these people do, can easily be summarized with 0. You do not have any labels, any annotations of what these people actually do. What you do know is, though, what is their background, what is their demographics, what is their health status, where do they live, what's their socioeconomic status. What people do now is they go ahead and aggregate this kind of data and come up with conclusions about something like sleep. You can easily infer from movement data when is a person sleeping. You can also infer to some extent relatively low-level behaviors or relatively low-level activities such as mode of transportation, mode of locomotion. When do you walk? When do you cycle? When you're in the car? And then you can basically aggregate this on population level. And Aidan Doherty is leading in here, and there's many more people using actually this work. They come up with very interesting conclusions on the health and the general state of a population based on their behavior. Well, if that's not enough, then people actually push it even further. So this is work, relatively recent work from Tim Althoff from Stanford. He's now at University of Washington in Seattle. He said, like, population is fine, let's do the whole planet. And he basically piggybacked on the fact that many people have mobile phones, and he collected data using a specific app, a Zoomio app, on 68 million people. And the data is not very high fidelity, it's low fidelity, it's step data. So it doesn't tell you exactly what you're doing, but it gives you a good picture of how much are you moving, how active are you. And then you can compare it in different countries. Very interesting results there. Just 2 glimpses in here. So what he basically did is he came up with a measure which he calls activity inequality, which is technically the Gini index of the distribution of the movements of a population. So it basically measures the tail ends, how long are the tail ends of your population, of the distribution of your activities in a population. Right? If it's a normal distribution, then they are very small. Well, you have very small difference or discrepancies in there. Here is one of the parameters. There are a lot of parameters in his papers in there. I encourage you to read this paper. And then he tries to link these 2 variables here. And there's some interesting aspects here. So activity inequality large means a lot of differences in the population, how people actually move. Fraction of obesity going up. You see one here. All right? So I live in the US for 2.5 years now. I know how hard it is to get around without a car. And I also see the obesity in there. It might also be the food, granted. But there's a clear correlation here. On the other end here, you have cultures in Asia, where there's much more general movement in any case, with a much lower fraction of obesity in there. Again, granted, food plays an important role as well. Finally, here, he measured something like the gender gap. That's basically in a way, so how different are males and females moving? And how is it related to this activity inequality? And you see at the opposite ends of the spectrum, conventional or more traditional, very conservative cultures, such as in the Middle East, where you have a huge gender gap in here, links to activity inequality. In Scandinavia, where the gender gap is arguably much smaller, much lower activity inequality, which ultimately leads to a much better health in there. Right? So that's interesting because that's on planet scale. You can do entirely different approaches, and that's where the field is heading to. I'm running a bit over time, so that's why I'm moving on. So where are we and where are we going? Quo vadis behavior assessment. In case you wondered, this is the standard picture of Nodus Observer. That's a software that you use for basically annotating behaviors that's used widely in the psychology field. That is their reference lab, I believe, in Hungary. So that's like the one end of the spectrum where we start. Do everything in the clinic. This over there is a representation of where we actually want to go. We want to get outside of the clinic. We want to capture behavior, want to analyze behavior in an automated way outside of the clinic. And that's where we're heading to. And the lessons to be learned, or the summary of where is this field heading to, are as follows. Opportunistic sensing is a thing. Nobody is dogmatic about what kind of sensor you should use, unless you're a sensor producer and you want to sell as many units as you can. But typically from a practitioner's perspective, from a behavior assessment perspective, that's paradise. There's so many sensors out there and people use them in a creative way. They use them, they combine them, and there's even more sensors to come. So the Ubicom community, I mentioned that before, they meet next week in London. There's always a new sensor coming out there. People do that and they are accessible. So that's fantastic news. The evidence so primarily because of that, because of the availability of the sensors, the evidence collection for certain behavior assessments is moving rapidly out of the clinic. I don't think we're there yet that the majority of health data is recorded or collected outside of the clinic, as Gregory mentioned in 2011, but we're pushing there and we see this now. We've seen these large-scale deployments, and the primary factor there is the availability of wearables and the availability of mobile phones. We do population-wise assessments now, and the challenges are still there. Right? It's not all rosy, because with the availability, so if you remember the curve we had, by moving out of the clinic, we're leaving this comfort zone of our lab, our clinic, where we have everything under control. The data becomes messy. Data becomes noisy, which is a substantial challenge for the analysis there. Two more aspects. I didn't talk about individualized assessments. So these large-scale population and planet-scale assessments, they're great. But if you think about the scenarios we had, like this autism assessment, this autism screening over here, that's highly individualized. That's the thing where the community is pushing, has to push. Individualized assessments. So what is different on this little boy compared to the other one, compared to a girl that's maybe half a year older or something. So this individualized assessment, that's a challenge not for the recording, that's primarily a challenge for the assessment. There's a big trend in the machine learning community looking to personalization and model adaptation. The last thing I didn't talk at all about, there is a substantial issue with trust. If we have all these sensors out there and we tell everyone we can record all your data, people are scared, and we've seen this now. It's a real thing. My mom doesn't wear a Fitbit because she knows what we can do with that. It's outrageous because that's the total opposite of the spectrum. Right? So you don't want to overshare, but not sharing at all doesn't benefit you at all. And I think we as a community, as the machine learning community, as the computational community, need to make an effort here to regain trust in these assessments. And regaining this trust, it doesn't help that Cambridge Analytica was around on that. That doesn't really help to make a case. What would help make the case is, how do you convince the patients, how do you convince the caregiver that what you're doing, what you're recording, what you're capturing is for the benefit of the patients? One answer to that one is, don't use cloud computing. Don't share the data. Do it locally, do it online, do it on the device. There are some wonderful examples what people are doing there. Many, many challenges there. What it's trying to get across here is behavior assessment, computation behavior assessment is a field that's mature. It's there. It has a substantial impact on clinical assessments. It has a substantial aspect on the computing community, because so many challenges, real-world challenges are in there that are tackled by the community. And I believe it overlaps quite a bit with the affective computing, interactive intelligence computing. At the very least, we have every now and then we use the same sensors. You should probably use more sensors. There's many, many more sensors out there. But we're tackling probably very much the same challenge in the analysis, at least. Thank you very much.